Welcome to the Living Springs Q&A podcast, where your questions are answered live every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Hey! Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A podcast. Special welcome from Kyle. He just wanted to
Blake, you lost your job.
get it all there.
I've returned. Oh, man.
Nice. Good day. Welcome. We're ready to get into some questions. We got AER right off the top, so we will jump in and see what this has to say. First question. Hi there. It seems like the transgender question from a while back has morphed into something larger and broader with questions and comments that you say your team is filtering and deciding what should and what shouldn't make it on the podcast. Rather than doing that, which could be seen as censorship, why not schedule and host a town hall meeting or series of meetings where anyone who wants to talk about this hot topic can come out and share their thoughts? No censorship, no agenda, just moderated conversation based on mutual respect, love, and a desire to learn about each other and from each other and grow regardless of left or right, happy horse crap, human beings, being and meeting the middle or meeting in the middle or at least trying to do that. Imagine the what ifs that could come from an event like this. Nobody hiding behind the anonymity of a Q&A wall. An example for others to see what can happen when God's people come together as strands of a rope. Just a thought.
A good. I appreciate the thought. I will genuinely say I see where you're coming from and wanting that. I will say we have had difficult conversations and offerings and teachings on this in the past. We've run the course Grace and Truth, which deals with LGBTQ things of all sorts. Yep. Preston Sprinkle, the author of that, has continued to add to it with more kind of the gender identity conversations. So I will see where you're coming from. Yes, learning on this is important, but I don't know if just randomly all of a sudden bringing everybody together from the small audience that's been sending things on this question together all of a sudden will end in the result immediately from just having it happen that you're hoping. Not saying we won't do further conversation and group conversation in the future, but I just don't think all of a sudden calling that will happen and lead to the fruitful hope, although I love your hopefulness there. I just don't think that's going to happen. As for filtering, I don't think we're filtering for the sense of trying to hide anything. We have publicly acknowledged we got some emails, which would be the opposite of censoring. We've just figured we don't need to read every email that comes in response to a question. It wasn't further question. It was just simply, hey, did you see this side of the conversation? We just weren't going to do that because it's just going to be a tennis match or ping pong back and forth with one article to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. So I don't think we're censoring, and we're definitely not scared of having the conversation, but that's also not what this platform is itself.
We have said so many times, this is the question will not die.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say right now, this is a question that will die because I'm not going to allow it to be brought up again on the podcast. If that is censorship, I am a censorer. I am totally okay with that. And I appreciate this person's heart. We answered the question. We made the decision that we were not going to pursue and just fall into left-right argument of people making statements supporting their view, because that is not inherently what this podcast is. The podcast is ask the pastors questions. It has been that for hundreds of episodes. It will continue to be that for as long as we do it. That's what we wanted it to be. That's what we created it to be. We didn't want it to turn into I can't say he said, she said, because I don't know who sent them in. Yeah. They said. Where we're just like, I can appreciate this person's heart. Yeah. I don't understand why this question won't die. I will say, I think it's funny, the no censorship, no agenda, just moderated conversation. Moderated conversation is going to lead to censorship because you're moderating the conversation. Yep. And I think that's healthy to have moderated conversation. I'm not against it. I just think And I'm not even against the idea of a town hall where you talk about things. I mean, the early church did that when they ran into issues.
Yep.
I think that the problem, and so this is where my hesitation comes in on a town hall, is I'm if this sounds terrible, then I ask forgiveness in advance for what I'm about to say if this offends anyone. But in the early church, they came together and they sought God on these issues. Yeah. They didn't come together and argue back and forth left and right. You can do that. You can watch that on any news program any night of the week.
Yep.
And the idea of the left and the right coming together and arguing until we see each other's sides, I just don't see the success in that happening based on cable news being a thing for decades and the schism only getting wider. Yep. I think if you're going to have a town hall, everyone has to come with the heart that I'm not here to speak my opinion. We are coming together to pray and seek God's heart on the matter. Yep. The church is not and has never been a democracy. Yep. The church is a benevolent dictatorship, and the dictator is Jesus. That is it. And if we are going to come together, now as pastors, we share what we believe to be God's heart. Yep. And where God is leading us, and that is the reason for this podcast. But at the end of the day, getting together for a town hall and deciding something based on discussion, that's a democracy. Right. And that's not the way that the church is meant to function. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm just saying if we're going to have a town hall, it is going to be bathed in prayer, and it is going to be like and it's going to be more of a prayer meeting than people just getting up and talking.
Yep, totally.
That kind of reminds me, Doug, and you've heard me say this before, the church that I used to be a pastor in, the denomination, dealt with the idea, or not idea, but the proposal to ordain women. Yep. And the first conference we had where that was going to be an open forum, basically a town hall to be discussed, I would say from what I believe to be a Christian and godly way of doing things was probably one of the grossest things I've ever watched. Right. It was just terrible. Yeah. It was hateful. People on both sides just screaming and yelling. And
I've been in similar pastors' conferences where they're debating issues. Yep. Yes.
So 4 years later, they did it again. They tabled it 2 years and then waited for the 4. And then it was bathed in prayer, and it was very different. And that was probably one of the best Christian conferences I've ever sat in, where people really actually sought God rather than just their own agenda. So, if we were to do that with this issue, I would hope it would be the same way, because the others just, I don't know. Some people really get a kick out of that. Maybe I don't. It hurts my feelings.
I don't think all opinions are equal either, right? I'm thinking of an upcoming conference in the new year. Theology in the Raw is hosting their second conference, and they're doing a conversation, is what they've been calling it, on women in ministry. Funny enough that you mentioned that topic. And so they've got 2 scholars on one side and 2 scholars on the other who are coming together to have that conversation. That seems more valid, to be honest. Add and include the prayer part for sure, and prioritize that as well. Then we have a conversation, not just everybody and their dog with their opinion from whatever level of feelings. I think is an important thing to consider as well when we're having serious and important and conversations that have implications on people's lives and how they live that out. I don't think just every opinion is equal either. If we're to have genuine, real conversation, I think teaching often around such issues needs to precede that as well.
I would say that this podcast, we want to address issues of faith, and we've endeavored to do that, like I say, for hundreds of episodes. We have tried to help people wrestle through what faith looks like in the context of their world and their situation. Yep. But as a church, my heart has never been, and the older I get, the less it is, to become a place where we focus on social issues. Yep. The church is meant to focus on Christ. And if we're going to come together, let's talk about Jesus. Let's focus on Jesus. And I get we got to work this out. But I guess I'm not confident that people on different sides of the spectrum are going to be changed except by the Holy Spirit. Yep. And reason Nobody's ever been argued into a different position. It happens constantly on the news. It happens constantly on social media, and it's never effective. What will change people's hearts, wherever you are, we all could grow in this area. Guaranteed, no one has got it right. But it will only be as the Spirit leads us. It will only be as God chooses to work in that area of our life. And we can't dictate which area of our life Christ is going to work in. He chooses where he wants to work. And so I can appreciate this person. Maybe this is an area where they are wrestling, and that's why they want to have more content. I would encourage you, the place, and maybe you're already doing this, and if you are, great. But the place to begin is silent meditative prayer and listening to the Holy Spirit, who Jesus said is the one who will lead us into all truth.
I love this person's heart and their hope for a church united around everything. I will affirm that all day long.
But I would also say the church united is never meant to be the church in agreement.
Never a church in uniform, but united is not uniform.
Paul doesn't say in Philippians, Paul doesn't say be united in theology and in social issues. Be united in spirit and purpose. And that is what we're called to be united in. And that's the Bible that didn't say be united in theology. But Paul in Ephesians talks about as we come into maturity in our faith, we will come more and more into unity. That, again, is a process, Christ-led process by the Spirit of God of refining and changing and renewing us and transforming us into the point that we see the world more and more like Jesus did, and we love more and more like Jesus did, and therefore our actions will change. So the only way that we will come into greater unity, according to Paul in the book of Ephesians, is to all be growing in our faith. And as we grow in our faith, we will come more and more into unity because we'll be transformed more and more into the image of Jesus. But we can't dictate to the Holy Spirit, you're going to work in this area and you're going to give us the answer in here.
All right, we can probably move to the next question. I guess just to clarify, Doug, when you said this question is dead or will die, meaning further on this question. If people have more questions in this topic.
For sure.
If somebody's got a new question on this, yes. I'm just saying we have said over and over and over, like we're not going to, like let's move on from this. We answered the question, and I'm just saying, no, we've answered this question. I've answered this question a lot of times.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear on that. So.
Of course.
Maybe I'm just grumpy today, and maybe you'll see why in a bit.
Thanks, Blake.
It's not Blake's fault.
He
didn't make me grumpy.
Thanks, Blake, for clarifying that. That's all I'm saying.
Hey, everybody, Merry Christmas. Welcome to our podcast of Grumpy Pastors as we enter the Christmas season.
Well, Kyle's like really appreciating the heart of this person.
Yes.
And I'm like, no, this question is dead. And I'm just recognizing maybe I'm just in a grumpy mood. It happens.
We're allowed to have that.
But I just feel like we need to just move on from this question.
Sure.
If you have a new question about this issue, we'd love to hear it. But if it is a rehash of the same question,
there are no more A's, E's, or R's on this question, is what you're saying.
Yes.
I like that. That's very good. All right, next question. Directly to you, Kyle. Kyle, can you reference your point about looking down on Jesus when he was intersecting with homeless, sick, or gay? Why is it when gay rights is addressed, it's always within a context like this? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I really don't understand how someone loving who they love is the same as some of these other negative scenarios you guys end up discussing when discussing gay rights. It can actually be very damaging to someone listening who identifies as queer, and to be honest, I'm having a hard time understanding what your stances are on the LGBTQ community, as I find it has been dependent on what camp a questioner lands in. I'm wondering if, even though it's not the way the podcast is structured, if it's worth actually hashing this out on an episode with the members of the community. Not to be negative, just a bit confused by the comments. Worried you guys are out of your depth to answer these more complex gay rights questions.
I'm going to start right at the end really first, and then I'll address the beginning where it was addressed to me. We are absolutely out of our depth to answer these questions. We are three straight white men. We can't speak to all the depths of gay rights questions from a level of experience, knowledge, legal background, none of those things can we speak to it. We are absolutely out of our depth, and we've never claimed to be anything other. Many times we've started questions with, we are not professionals on this one. That I'll reiterate that. We are more than out of our depth to be able to speak to the full breadth of anything covering gay rights, for sure. And that is a disclaimer on this podcast, period. We speak from where we are to the best of our abilities. So with all that said, I'm going to get back to the beginning. Can you reference your point about looking down on Jesus when he was intersecting with homeless, sick, or gay? This is language that I've really tried to be conscious of myself because I've heard this brought up so many times. When talking about the subject, oftentimes the analogy that will get it brought in, talking about where people are at in their sexuality, and then compare it with drinking or with drugs or with anything else or sickness. I've really personally tried to be careful of this. My reference was how, whatever the issue may be, Christian culture right now seems to be caught in looking down on how Jesus might have responded to other issues. So I don't know if I mentioned it. I didn't go back and watch the clip. I was thinking specifically of how Jesus would have been in amongst refugees. And there's a lot of politically right ideology against how Jesus would deal with refugees, how some Christian groups are addressing the conversation on abortion. I don't think Jesus would be in the picket line. I think he'd be sitting next to people, which would get him in a lot of trouble with the Christians who are happening to make picket lines. So I wasn't speaking to my or any of our theology on the conversation around gay people at all, but specifically on how Jesus reacts would actually call into question our responses very often as a Christian culture, and that may affect me differently, where I might be a lot more comfortable with how Jesus would be interacting with the trans or gay community specific to the question, while I may have a really difficult response how he was treating somebody else because of the hardness of my own heart. And so I was trying just to be as humble as I could in recognizing that I may have been alongside, jumping quickly to say Jesus would be with the trans community, as Doug was talking about that, which is where the comment came in. But I know Jesus would be looking at me going, you hypocrite, in some other area. So to speak to, I was happy to be there where I am, and I often relay this when having conversations around anything LGBTQ, humbly admitting how quickly, as I had some shift and change and openness and care grow in my life for that, how fast within weeks I was looking at people who were holding the position I had just held and go, you bigots and jerks, and realizing through that lesson how hard my heart was, even just switching from one side to another or shifting in my position whatsoever, looking back on people. So as I was saying, Jesus would be looked down upon in how he responded to the trans community, and I would hope to be with him, recognizing there's still areas of my life where I am not standing with Jesus and how he'd respond, period. I'll stop there and let anybody else jump in, and we can keep going through the question. But that was my hope in the reference last week.
So this is where I'm going to show that I'm grumpy. This question, was the question that this is referring to, was not at all about gay rights.
No.
It was about trans.
Where would Jesus find himself with the trans community today?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet the response is all about gay rights.
Right.
So this question doesn't even speak to what we were speaking to.
Right.
Why is it when gay rights is addressed? Gay rights wasn't addressed in that question that we answered. We were talking about how Jesus would relate to the trans community and how the church would respond to it.
Right.
So I feel the need to say that.
Right.
Because Kyle, you can reference your point. Can you reference your point about looking down on Jesus when he's intersecting with the homeless, sick, or gay? We weren't talking about any of those. Right. We were talking about transgender. Right. So I would encourage whoever asked this question to go back and re-listen to that, because I think you're not hearing what was being said. Having said that, I echo what Kyle says. We never claim to be experts on any of these questions, but we do our best to give the answers that we can. However, I would also like to add that these are complicated issues, and I don't feel like when we get different questions, based on what the question is, I may look at my response may change. Yep. My thoughts may change. I think we've been pretty straightforward in our defense of gay rights on this podcast.
Yep.
And I know that because I've had the conversations with people who have taken exception to it.
Yep.
And that has been a pretty consistent thing that we have said. In fact, I don't know the episode, but I can remember sometime in this studio, not way back in the day, but sometime the three of us sitting here like this,
Yeah.
so that would be in the last year or so, like us talking about how like gay people who want to get married should be able to get married,
Yep.
and the church should not oppose that
Yep.
because that is a state-run thing, and gay people have those rights. And when homosexuals are not allowed to go see the person they love in the hospital because technically they're not married, that is wrong.
Yep.
Period. Like
Yep.
I feel like we've been pretty straightforward with those. However, I think that if you find somebody paints something with a broad brush, black and white, really easily, I question how much they're really thinking about it,
Right.
because these issues that we're talking about are not easy issues. And my perspective at the same time shifts and changes over time. And it's not the same that it was 15 years ago.
Yep.
And I readily admit that my perspective has changed. I hope that all of us have had areas of our lives over the last 15 years and over the last 6 months where our perspective on things have changed. So I think it's okay for things to change. And I would also like to say that I'll just end it there.
Well, I'll say I love this format. Like, I love that people can just write in a question about anything.
Yeah.
And then we have to answer. But we have acknowledged on this podcast quite a few times, we don't necessarily know who has asked the question or the position it comes in, right?
Yeah.
Someone can ask, a made-up question, just be like, oh, I'm curious about whatever. Or someone can ask a question, this is happening to me, what do I do?
Yep.
And when it's written and we get the question, we don't know which that is,
Yep.
right? So do we answer with just a blanket, this is our theology, this is how it is? Or do we answer with a pastoral heart like, oh my gosh, you're going through this, how do we walk with you?
Yep.
I would just say, back to our last question last week was, do cats and dogs go to heaven, right? We all have a position on that, and we made fun.
I do not
and
have a
we joked.
position on that.
Well,
My
okay.
position is I don't know.
But if pushed, we might be able to get to some theological decision. But if little Johnny comes to me and says, my cat just died, do you think he'll be in heaven? I'm not going to say, well, the theology of that is turn to this page in the Bible. I'm going to answer as a pastor and say, you know what? God loves people. He loves his creation, right? This is what we can hope for, right?
Yep.
So I'm just saying, there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. We are pastors. We try to answer theological questions theologically, but we understand that somebody can be in pain, and we also need to be very gentle with that.
Yep.
So, just there's a lot to the questions that come in.
I would encourage this person to go back and listen to the question. I feel like we answered that question pretty accurately. I don't feel like there was a lot of confusion in it, but the fact that they are continually through their response addressing gay rights, even where it says, I don't really understand how someone loving who they love is the same as these other. We weren't speaking in any way about anything gay in that question.
Right.
We were talking about trans and the trans community.
Yep.
And that the trans community and the gay community are not the same thing.
Right.
And so, I just would encourage this person to go back and listen with an open heart, because I felt like we answered the question fairly clearly, and I felt like, Kyle, you were just really honest, and you reflected, I think, probably the heart of every person
Right.
who, if they were being honest, would be that any person who whenever Jesus calls us to go meet with somebody new, we're going to struggle with that, and other people are going to misunderstand that.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of us being fallen people.
Yep.
So I would just encourage this person to listen to that again with an open heart. And if you're offended by my response, I'm sorry, I'm grumpy.
I'll continue on looking at this one just a little bit more too. The nature of this conversation is, yes, dictated by the questions that come in. I want to acknowledge that is true, and we are also not here. I understand and I appreciate the idea of wanting us to just make it really clear on the internet where we all stand, but as has already been addressed, we've changed our opinion many times. This has been 5 years plus of doing this podcast. you could go back and listen to something from us a couple years ago that we'd now vehemently disagree with. So A, I don't want to put things on the internet, and B, our hope is to pastor people. This is all, as Blake's already addressed in part, this is hypothetical in the air, even when we're answering the more pastoral questions. That is drastically different than somebody sitting down with us and us getting to pastor them, which is our main mode of operation here at the church, not podcasters. And so to put something in black and white as clearly as we can, unless we're asked it directly, to be honest, is just going to end up A, offending or being misunderstood, as has been evidenced by the whole of AER, which is totally fair. We're human and we're fallible. That's going to happen. I would much rather have that person come and want to talk to us and hear us out, so that when I'm caught in, as I've already addressed, caught in recognizing my words and way of expressing something could be hurtful, I want to be able to change that, not have it etched in the internet forever. I want to be able to go through that. And I'll just narrow it to myself, I am regularly offending people left of me and right of me. That I'm in a spot where we're going to do that. For somebody who is a part of the LGBTQ community or a queer of any kind, for them to be still listening to the podcast, I'm just going to assume there's a level of care that's coming through and a level of relationship of why you'd even bother to tune into this. We can't reach everybody. We have never hoped to be able to do so. We are trying to speak to people who are hurting, broken, who care about us, want to hear about what we have to say, and have seen the level of care that we're able to offer. That thank you for allowing us to continue to learn, but B, I don't want to write forever where we stand just on one episode versus be able to walk with you, hoping that I change as you do too. I'll answer that just for myself.
I like that. All right. Well, then let's get into this week's questions. First question is there ever a situation where God calls us to act with violence, even in war or in the protection of others?
I'm not going first because I answered first for the first two.
Okay, so I'll go first. And I'll say this is... Before I answer the question, I'd like to change the question.
Yeah.
Violence is a word, because if we're saying violence, I probably would say no.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. I like that.
But I think if we leave it there, that's an incomplete answer. Because is there ever a situation where God calls us to act with force? And I think there could be.
Okay.
Yes. I'm not saying that it's normal. I'm not saying it's always, but I think that there could be a time where we need to act with force in the defense of someone else. I don't think it would be in the protection of ourselves. Right. I think that is not right, but I think that there could be a time where we need to act with force. Period.
Okay. So I'll push further then. The war, where does that land? What level of force? I'm curious. I'm just curious. Genuinely, this is asking on the spot while on an episode.
I think if you have signed up to be in the army and a war breaks out, you made the decision that you were in the army.
Yep. Well, that's fair.
And then you need to go do your job.
Yep.
I think that there is personally, and I know you and I have a difference of opinion on this.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between a person choosing to act with something and somebody who's a soldier in a line of duty or a police officer in a line of duty.
Yep.
I think they're not the same thing. There is an element of the government being the agent of God's justice, a sphere of God's influence.
The sword, as Paul puts it in Romans 13. Right?
Yes. But I'm just trying to phrase it in
more modern language.
Yeah,
I get that.
The government being a sphere of God's influence, that God, I think, will hold government leaders accountable to what they do because of the role that they went in.
Yep.
I don't think that it's something that is flippant. Just like teachers will be judged more harshly and judged based on what they do. I think the people who end up in government, that's why we need to pray for them, because they will be judged based on what they do.
Yep.
And when they give an order to a soldier who has enlisted to go to war, that soldier, I think, then has a responsibility. Now, I'm not minimizing it, and I'm not saying the damage it does to souls is not, bodies and souls is not dramatic. I'm not saying even the people who survive war don't come away permanently scarred, and probably the only healing that could ever take place is found in Christ, and maybe some of that won't be totally fulfilled until Christ returns,
Right.
And the new heaven and the new earth are established. But yeah, I think what if it would happen? And there's a totally hypothetical situation, but if you saw someone abducting someone in the parking lot as you're about to walk into a store, do you just stand there and be like, I'm a pacifist?
Yeah.
Like, that's what I say. I think there are times where the use of force, and maybe it's not right, but I just don't think God's going to be that mad at you for doing something
I hear you.
to defend and to help someone who's being wronged, one of his creatures.
For the large part, I would entirely agree with you. And that's where I would land in a position of nonviolent theology, not in a position of pacifism. Pacifism calls for no force, anything whatsoever against another. Stopping to define violence is the perfect spot to say. I would say force is permissible. Violence is when it is intentional hurt of the other, without purpose. So using a scenario, I've got a number of friends who have been police officers and are police officers where we've had this discussion where their level of force needed to stop somebody from harming others or even themselves takes them tackling them, or they won't put their arm in the right spot to be able to subdue them. So they've sometimes got to give them a little jab. I would be totally okay with saying that is useful and purposeful force. The violence, and this is where the specific example talking with my one friend was like, now that guy was a real jerk trying to get him down, so I'm going to give him one more punch to the ribs just for good. Now we've crossed into violence.
Yes.
And so I would go, that is opposed to what God wants for us. The classic scenario you've already addressed, kidnapping, absolutely. I can use force up to the point of stopping somebody. And where I would draw the line is a Christian should never and will, I don't think God would ever call them into the point of killing. And so that's where I would say nonviolence is allowing a level of force without a level of killing. Within Canada, I would say I think the police force, you can do that well. I am really proud of watching a number of years ago when the terrorist attack in Toronto took place. The guy who rented the van was running over people with that, and the officer was there, and the guy was trying to go suicide by cop, pulling out of his coat, pretending to have a gun, and the officer refused to shoot him. Officers in Canada are trained extremely diligently to not use their weapons. And so I would say even within policing in Canada, I think that's something you can do very carefully and stay within the realm of force. Jumping to the question and crossing the line into putting yourself in a situation where you are going to kill somebody, that is something I don't think God would call us to. And so I would take the language of Romans 13 saying God uses governments as swords of justice. I feel that's an accommodation of going, yeah, let's let governments kind of rule things so they're not worse than they already are. Let's keep things from getting to the purge. So we're going to let governments bring some level of justice, though it's not God's justice. It's not his standard of justice that will be enacted. And so for going to war, if I were sitting with somebody right now who is talking, I'm interested in going into the military, I would say I don't think that God would call you into that. Now, there's levels of accommodation and conversation. I've got friends in the Army who I've had this conversation with. I think God can have grace. But to go in and as the individual, as a part of the sword, to take Paul's language, or sphere of influence, as you've put it, Doug, puts myself in a position where I'm likely in the Army to end up in, especially in a time of war, end up pulling a trigger and taking life from another image of God. Which I would just say is not the early Christians for the first 3 centuries would have nothing to do with any kind of position of war or army whatsoever. Because they'd be put in that position. I know this is a drastically apples to oranges comparison, but I think there's some things that draw it together. If I'm putting myself in a spot where I can see it is very likely that something will end up in harm and damage or sinfulness, I would not go to that. And the quick analogy that popped into my head, I wouldn't encourage a Christian to be a stripper. Hold on. Because I go, the only end of that is to cause somebody else into lust. That is the purposeful end. But you can say, but I'm in great shape, and that person looking at me is doing what they want with what I'm doing, and it's helping me, and it's able to pay for whatever argument you want to make. The ultimate end of that role is to do something that leads to sin and harm. So although that's hyperbolic, I would draw that back into the end of a Christian serving in the army. The end of that, to a degree, is going to end up causing, in all likelihood, or at least a large majority, end up causing death and destruction both on another image bearer of Jesus and, as has already been mentioned, massive impacts on yourself. So I'm totally okay with recognizing Romans 13, God allows governments to act as swords of justice within the world. But for the individual Christian, I would not say we should be signing ourselves up for positions such as serving in the army.
I think that view is very narrow.
Sure.
The army responds to disasters
Absolutely.
way more than they have in war.
Totally.
The Canadian Army has spent decades on peacekeeping missions
Yep.
where they are helping people and defending people
Yep.
who can't defend themselves.
Totally. And that's where I can go. I affirm that that's happening in the Canadian military as a branch of the sword that Paul speaks of in Romans 13.
Yes, and so I just think and if you say no Christian can ever join the army,
Yep.
how do you ever have salt and light in the army? Like I just look at that and go, I think that is a naive
Yep.
view. Like, because if you want to only ever have just war,
Yep.
then you need to have just people.
Which I would
in
argue
the
isn't
army.
and that's where I would argue even with the idea of just war.
How could you not, if a nation invades another one and that nation defends themselves, that's not just that they defend themselves?
And this is the differentiating part. I'm not saying Paul affirms that nations can and should have armies to keep some level of justice alive, which is an accommodated version of it. But for the individual Christian to say, I am fulfilling my following of Jesus by signing up into something that could end up doing that. Now, by all means, I do think the Canadian military is doing some great things to protect or even to help within domestic scenarios here in Canada. They've done lots of great work. So if you can sign up to only be a domestic person, throwing sandbags in times of flood, shoveling when Toronto needs it, whatever it may be, there are ways to serve in what the Canadian military does that are commendable, absolutely. But the kind of peacekeeping that even the Canadian Army does, I'm not going to say and disagree with Romans 13 that it isn't for some good purpose, but that purpose is still lesser than God's true justice. And B is the same kind of peace that Rome offered in its time, the Pax Romana, bringing the peace of Rome, which just means we had a bigger stick. It's not solving the issue. And so again...
Well, no, you can't compare Pax Romana to a conflict in the 21st century because Rome ruled the world, and that's how they got that way. So you're telling me Russia invades Ukraine,
Yep.
and every Ukrainian Christian should have just left?
I'm not saying that. Again, the level... I don't have all the answers.
Well, but that is
means.
what you're saying. You're saying that there's no just war.
No.
And that you shouldn't ever do anything that could lead you to kill somebody.
I would think under mandated need for within your own country, find a way you can help and assist people that is not going to put you as an individual in a place to bear a gun against another human and pull the trigger. So if that is being...
I want to clarify something there
Yeah.
because I'm okay with where you're going, but
Yeah.
I think we're just restating it. But I just think... And I think what you're going to say, but it doesn't matter. I want to ask the question.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so if I'm a Christian, you're saying to me, like, I shouldn't be in the army because I could end up killing someone. I could get there.
Yeah.
This is a position where I've changed. I don't think I would have been like that 5 years ago, but today I'm like, okay, maybe God does believe in this nonviolence thing. But then my buddy, who's a non-Christian,
Yeah.
I'm like, he needs to defend me. And
Right.
it's okay for him to shoot somebody because he's not a Christian? Is that what I put my hope in? I put my hope in my buddy who's not a Christian?
No, and I appreciate that point. That's a great one. And again, I don't have all the answers, but I look at that scenario and go, yes, he's being a part of exactly what Paul's talking about in Romans 13. So we can commend the good things we see of that. I know what you're doing to the best of your abilities through the way that you see justice. You're trying to back that up. I don't think he should be forced to by any means. I'm not saying that. But as to how I live out my faith, and my wife and I have chatted about this all the time because if we all of a sudden went into a place where everybody's conscripted again, if we're in some kind of war and I'm forced to go, but I have some level of influence. I know even as clergy we get to. How do you help? Can I sign up as some role of being a medic or being a pastor, even within that context, and chaplain,
I
whatever?
hope that as a clergy, they don't let you be a medic.
Well, you pray
Just
for healing. It might be
lifting
really
people
good.
from one spot to another. That's all. But all I'm saying is, I think there are ways you can, and because we are in a broken and messed up world where God's justice is not yet seen, all I'm saying is, an individual, should you be going into a position where you may then be called to what I would say go against what God ultimately desires, for you to end up taking life from another image bearer of Him, which goes beyond what I would call force into the level of violence. No, and I appreciate that you already recognize the nuance, Doug, of we shouldn't even defend ourselves to the point of protecting our own lives. In that, again, this is just one of those hypothetical conversations my wife and I have had. Somebody breaks into our home to try to rape and kill our whole family. My job is to protect our family with as much force as I can to get them to be free, to go away. I will never run to the kitchen to grab the knife to kill that guy and take his life, even if that means I ultimately fail in my attempt to stop him, because we have hope of resurrection within our family as followers of Jesus, that I do not have the right to take somebody else's life. And I think that applies even then unto war, where I will not put myself in a position to try to live out my faith and enact killing violence. If that's the definition of it. And I know there's many people who disagree with me. C.S. Lewis himself writes there's lots of encouragement for people to join the army. So I'm not saying this is written in red. This is where I land.
So the Roman centurion,
Yeah.
who gets saved.
That happened. They were told to leave the army many times. That you can't be a follower of Jesus as an individual and be a Roman centurion. That happened in the early church many times.
I wrestle with that. I wrestle
Totally.
with I understand war is never God's heart.
Yep.
If God had his way, it would never happen. God doesn't get his way
Yeah.
the vast majority of the time.
Yep.
And I guess I just look at it and go, I'm not that I can't come to the place where I could say to someone definitively, the Holy Spirit of God would never lead you down that road.
Right.
I think you could make a lot of statements.
Yep.
The Holy Spirit of God is never going to lead you down that road.
Yep.
I cannot come to the place of saying that would never happen,
Right.
because I recognize the government as a sphere of God's agency, and the only way that things get reformed
Yep.
and get salted
Yep.
is for salt to be in there.
Yep.
I think we can. I like these questions because these ones remind me of my youth days. And I think, okay, so what does this mean to me, right? Because I'm not signed up to be a soldier, and I'm not going to be a police officer either. So then am I off the hook on this question?
Right.
But I'm like, no, I think, for everyone who's listening to this podcast right now, you say, Kyle, if someone busts into your house, this is how you'd act. But chances are no one's ever going to bust into your house, right?
Exactly.
So what do you do with this nonviolence thing? And I think, okay, how's this playing out in my life? Just one little example I have, I love to hunt. But I have really scaled back what I will shoot. And it's a weird thing that happened to me a few years ago. I remember seeing a certain animal in my sights, and I was like, yeah, that would give me pleasure, but I'm just not sure that that's right anymore. Now, when I say that, hunting for food, I have no problem with. Like, if I'm going to eat it, but as a farm kid, I will readily admit that I've shot a lot of things that were not to eat. It was just because I had a gun and I could, right? Yeah. And so that was the moment where I was like, maybe I shouldn't just kill for my own pleasure, right? Yeah. And I know that's animals, but I think, okay, so then, dumb it down again. What do I do when my wife makes me mad? Is yelling at her okay? Is that violence, right? Maybe I'm not hitting her, or even my children, right? Yeah. Like,
totally,
my children can make me really upset, right? So where does that all factor in? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I think that it's easier to have a nonviolent theology.
Yep.
in a safe world.
Totally.
Like I think when you look at South America and you look at the liberation theology
Yep.
that grew up in South America,
Yep.
and I'm not saying it's right,
Nope.
but you see a totally different.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's wrong either. I'm not saying anything. All I'm saying is people who grew up where there was mass injustice,
Yep.
In their following of Christ,
Yep.
they come to completely different ends
Yep.
than we do in our environment.
Yep.
And so that's where, for me, I go, I can't go to, and I respect where you are,
Yep.
but I can't get there.
Yep.
Um,
We live in a really privileged position, absolutely. And the situation where somebody's breaking into my home, it's great for me to talk hypothetically because I know it's just not going to happen.
and hypothetically, you
But-
don't know how you'd respond.
Exactly. But at the same time, I do again look to early Christians. I know, Blake, you read the Patient Fermented the early church of, they were faced with mass injustice that cost them many, many lives. And I look at modern examples, most predominantly coming to my mind of MLK, like his willingness to go nonviolently, to go at the cost of both lives and massive injury, to stand up in front of forces. I'm not saying, again, this is all right, but I've seen ways that it's been dealt with nonviolently that have not called people to that. I'm not written in red by any means, but I think there can be ways we speak to power without picking up the same sword that Rome uses, so to speak.
And I absolutely agree with that.
Yep.
I guess I just don't believe that God may never call us to infiltrate that power
Sure.
to help make it,
Yep.
to help bring reform to it.
Yep. I look
And
at-
that's where, if we're outside of the power,
Yep.
yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
right? Like, and it's easy to say when you're sitting in comfortable Airdrie, Alberta.
Totally.
So I'm not minimizing it.
Yep.
What Martin Luther King Jr. did in calling those people to that standard, or Gandhi,
Yep.
like that was incredible,
Yep.
and they brought change in a way that did not resort to violence, which is amazing. But if you look at both of those situations,
Yep.
they ended up paying a price
Yep.
because the people in power
Yep.
were corrupt.
Totally.
So you're saying no Christian can ever get into the place of power to reform that power,
Right.
that it wouldn't be corrupt. Therefore, people are going to always have to passively fight against that power and give up their lives as the only way that anything will ever change. And I go, I don't know that works.
I hear you, and I again, really privileged position I'm sitting in to be able to answer that. But I go, I think, and this is the Anabaptist influence on me. My views of Christians in government would be very similar. I know this is, I'm probably fishing for more questions, but I go, I don't think we should be inside the system because you can't be serving Babylon and the kingdom of God at the same time. So I don't care how Babylon gets reformed or getting into it to be able to reform it. That would be the call to stay outside of it and influence it for the kingdom, that the kingdom expands.
But the problem with that is that, so you stay outside of Babylon.
Yeah.
And you create a whole nother culture.
Yeah.
And a whole nother society is birthed.
Yeah.
There's power in that society. There is inevitably going to be power in that society.
Yep.
So then, do you have to abdicate the power in that society?
Well,
Yeah, you just move
your
on again.
argument, your
People have
argument
done that.
is self-defeating, right? Like because if you say, okay, we can't be in government, we're gonna go out to the middle of nowhere in Alberta.
No, not
we're
saying
gonna
that.
buy a bunch of land. We're gonna be like our own little people.
Yeah.
Well, there's power within that group.
No, not saying
And that group can turn into Babylon.
Of course it can, and it will over and over again all the time. But for me to formally decide I'm going to go join some nation state and serve them, I look at Jeremiah's call when they're brought into Babylon. He did not say, all right, get in there, work up to your positions of power, and then change Babylon from the inside. He says, no, marry, plant gardens, and pray for the good of Babylon while you're within it. That was the call that Jeremiah had for the people. Then you look at Daniel and all the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'll try to get the pronunciation right on that one. They were forced into those positions and served within them faithfully, but they never searched for those spots to be able to change and influence where they were put captive. But Jeremiah's call was never go and change Babylon. It was pray for its well-being and make yourself at home while you can, honoring Yahweh to the best of your ability in your situation.
And I think that that's also an indication of the fact
Yeah.
that A, they were sent into Babylon for 70 years as a result of their own sin.
Totally.
So there's a part of that. And B, there was no election in Babylon.
Totally.
That was not going to happen.
of course, it's apples
And
to
so
oranges.
I think you can't take Jeremiah's message to the Israelites in exile and make that a universal proclamation across the church when we now live in a democratic society
Totally.
where we have a whole different form of government
Yep.
than what Jeremiah was even speaking to.
Of course, we don't have biblical examples that are one and the same. And again, I looked at modern examples that would counter my opinion, like Bonhoeffer, who used his position to try to make an assassination against Hitler in his attempt to do so with some level of power.
But would you agree with your nonviolent theology?
Yeah.
What do you think of his assassination?
I think he was doing something wrong. I think he crossed the line. And so I would even go then, this is conversation for Christians within the Army for Reform or government period. You can absolutely go in with the best hopes of I want to be salt and light in this environment. You've said you had a friend that went into politics at one point of like, you can't get into government without compromising. I go, that's just what's going to happen. So I'd rather not go into that place because if it were me, I know I'm weak, and B, humans all are. So I think you're going to end up trying to sprinkle a little bit of salt into Babylon and end up becoming more Babylon than you are salt. And I go, I just don't think it's ever going to end well without you compromising some way or another. Again, maybe there's stronger people than me.
I don't think it's stronger people, though. This is where I think you and I would disagree.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of strength in yourself.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of could God give someone grace to work toward that end? And if God hasn't graced you to do something, you're not going to succeed at it.
Yeah.
But if God has given you the grace, then success is a possibility.
Sure.
It's not guaranteed because you can receive the grace of God in vain. 2 Corinthians 6:1 says that.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the grace, you're not going to succeed.
Totally.
But to say because it's hard and because a lot of people have failed, God could never give someone grace to go and do that.
Yeah.
I again go, okay, but then inevitably we're going to withdraw and we're going to create our own subculture. And that's going to inherently at some point have a power structure.
Totally.
That
I agree.
so it seems to me that you're trying to say we need to always stay out of Babylon.
Right.
But at the same time,
We become Babylon.
Well, exactly.
Totally.
So,
But instead of saying, well, since we're eventually going to end up being Babylon, let's just jump in and join them.
that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you're saying always avoid Babylon.
Yep.
But I'm saying then you're constantly running from everything in the world.
And I don't think I'm running. I'm just saying I don't want to sign up to be a part of what I already know to be. And this is where I think there's a level of life cycle for churches who become Babylon. We're watching them fall apart now day after day with mega churches in the Western world. They are
I don't want to say every megachurch is Babylon. I think you need to be careful there.
We have seen this in a number of mega churches and even smaller churches that just act in the same way. They become Babylon in amongst themselves. And so there's a natural life cycle because we're going to follow through with that. But I hope the level of grace and salt and light that are applied and the life cycle that comes as a level of God's judgment, allowing us to fall out so we could start again with faithfulness, trying to do our best versus just saying, well, I see that's a good power. I'm going to go over and try to help influence it. I just don't think it's going to end well. And in the end, when God's kingdom is fully established, there will be no such thing as Canada, US, whatever country you want to name, because those Babylons ultimately have to fall away, period, for his kingdom to be fully established, that we can find things with one another.
Yeah, and I'd push back on you a little bit, Doug, and just say, like, we have to live with some sort of ideals. We can't just be like, whatever. Right?
I'm not saying whatever.
Like, so
what
I
I'm saying is
I think Kyle's ideal of nonviolence sounds good to me. I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. Now, could God interject and say, Blake, we need you to do whatever? And if I prayed and I listened and I had people in my life that, spoke into that, then yes, I think God can probably do that. And I think in some cases probably does. But I think the ideal is good. I wouldn't push on that.
I think one
I'm
more
not
thing.
opposed to the ideal.
Yeah.
But all I'm saying is power structure, like you're always going to have power.
Yeah.
And if you're always worried about it becoming Babylon and you're going to withdraw from power,
Yeah.
you're in a position of power right now.
Totally.
Because you're a pastor in this church.
Yep.
Right? So I'm like,
I totally see what you're saying. And I know it's still messy. There's no right answer to it. And I also theoretically would say, what if somebody's a part of government and then they decide to become a follower of Jesus? Can Jesus lead them there? And maybe down the road he goes, yeah, maybe you shouldn't be a part of this anymore. Absolutely. That's a possibility. I have friends, as I've mentioned, that are in the army that I'll sit and have this conversation with going, I know you're doing it the best of your ability. God just hasn't shown you that my theology yet at this point. And I can joke with them to say, okay, I see the value of justice you're searching for, but to take it out of the pastoral realm for a moment to say, what's my theological ideal, as you've already put it, I just don't think we should sign up for those positions. And yeah, the church is so far for 2,000 years proven itself to end up becoming Babylon's. It was only 300 years before we got Constantine involved with church and ruined that whole thing. And now we've made little entities unto ourselves of different churches of whatever size where we end up misusing power. That I think maybe there's ways we can, help ourselves for that within our church. Absolutely, I recognize I'm in a position of power. But at the same time, we've got levels of accountability with our board to do the best possible to try to keep those from becoming something that they shouldn't be. And I know some other structures have that as well. But I don't think the hope is to retreat out to the middle of nowhere, Alberta, and create our own society. That's not it, because that will ultimately do it itself. But instead, to hope for the best, to be as faithful as we can, recognizing we're going to fail that, versus jumping in, joining some other Babylon that's already existed, that seems in its essence to already be further away than we hope to be, in where it stands in accordance to God's kingdom.
And I guess where I land is, until Babylon is fallen, I'm not going to say, whatever Babylon we're talking about, I'm not going to say God might not call an individual and grace an individual to go work towards that end.
Right.
In the same way that there have been churches that have been very toxic and very unhealthy, and God has called pastors in to pastor them only for them to get killed. Because he's gracious and that person willingly gave their life to serve God, and God says, I want you to go here. Like with Jeremiah, they may not respond, but then they at least can't say they didn't have the option of repentance.
Totally.
So I guess I just look at it and go, I don't think that God would never say to someone, I'm going to give you the grace to go to attempt to bring reform to this thing that's well down the path to becoming Babylon.
And I don't think you're a heretic for that. I just disagree.
I think you're a heretic.
Right on.
We've established that long time ago.
We are right up against time, so that will be our last question for today. Keep sending the questions in. We like them.
Yeah.
We will see you guys next week.
See you guys.
Have a great week.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com. Thanks for tuning in.